when I first heard recently about what happened to these lovely children in the residential schools, it actually broke my heart. And it made me sad, unbelievably sad. I've been trying to work, and I've learned a lot about, the First Nations people for a long time. I went on the March of the Remembrance and Hope with indigenous people on at least 17 times, and I met many of them. And I remember quite clearly that suddenly it had an idea that I had one of the indigenous women that was with me was a mature woman. She was, going to get her PhD, which she recently actually got in Vancouver. And I said, and I discussed it with her, and she said, my mother is a residential school survivor. And this was in 2009. And suddenly I thought to myself, the important thing is that the people in Canada, the white people, the other people, everybody should know what happened to the indigenous people in this country. What happened to the First Nation people, how they were treated. And I suggested to her, I said, look, we're having a March of Remembrance and Hope, which we're taking people from Canada to learn what happened in the Holocaust in Poland and in Germany. I mean, why can't we organize a March of Remembrance and Hope to take people, Canadians, to both reserves and to places where many, First Nations people are actually living, and let them tell the stories of what happened in the residential schools, what happened to them, and how they were treated. Because I think people in Canada generally just don't know what happened to them, and they should be aware. They must know, and something should be done about it. And this is long before I heard of such terrible things like the latest thing. As a matter of fact, I was listening to the radio. The Ontario government is setting up a commission to get together with Indigenous people to start, discovering what else had happened, how many more graves there are. I mean, this is disgusting. I mean, how is it possible, for human beings to do things like that, especially to small children? And so immediately she told me that her mother was a residential school survivor. She came up with the idea that they live in Sudbury, that I should come up to Sudbury, tell my story, make a documentary, and her mother would tell her story. They wouldn't dovetail at all. It's just that two survivors of iniquity would tell their stories. And this was done. It's a documentary that's won prizes. It's been shown over. It's called Without Words. And it's a very, very, unbelievably good documentary to show what actually happened. I mean, this lady, the mother of the First Nations person that came to me in 2009 on the March of Remembrance and Hope. I mean, the two of us went and told our stories. We said what happened to us. Now, the one thing that actually, it very much is something that touched me, because she was telling me how when they were scrubbing them and cleaning them and making them hurt them because they were trying to make them clean for some reason, and they were scratching their hair and rubbing them, and they actually hurt them. And then I remember when I arrived in one of these concentration camps, the first thing they did, they threw me into a huge kind of like a jacuzzi, but a huge kind of concrete things were full of disinfectant. And if I didn't put my head under, one of these guys stood there, with a thing, and he knocked me over the head. So I had to go under. When I came out, every orifice in my body was burning, and it just kind of reminded me. And I was only 11 years old at the time. So I really feel that it should stop. The way that Indigenous people, that the First Nations people are being treated in Canada generally, not necessarily the worst thing that happened to the residential schools. We're not even talking about that, but the way they're even treated today, that should stop. And people should really take cognizance of the fact that we are all human beings. We must all be treated exactly, and their culture and their songs and everything that they have, their whole beings must be respected. This is the way I feel, and this is the way it should be. I really feel that it's terribly important, especially now when they discovered these terrible graves of these lovely little children. I mean, it just breaks my heart. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry.
When I joined the March of Remembrance and Hope in 2003, it was a very natural progression for where I was in my life and where I was going. At the time, I was 20 years old and I was attending the University of Toronto. I was studying Aboriginal studies and political science, and I knew that I wanted to be a lawyer. I knew that I wanted to fight for social justice for First Nation, Inuit, and Métis across Canada. So to join a program that was going to look at genocide through the lens of the Holocaust, that was going to promote the acceptance of diversity and inclusion, it was a great opportunity. It was a great opportunity for me. Now, one of the things I remember when we arrived in Poland were a number of lectures that we attended right off the bat. And one of the questions posed by the lecturers was, why? Why did German people, why did Nazis allow these crimes to happen? Why did they allow this to go on? And there were different answers to that question. It's not straightforward. Two of the ideas that I remember that were discussed were, number one, that the German people and the Nazis, they were ordinary people like you and I. They were working to take care of their own families during a wartime period. And they were able to be willfully blind to what was happening. But it was another lecturer who stood up and said that the reason why they allowed it to happen was because they were morally bankrupt. And I find myself reflecting on that often in the last several weeks. And the reason why is obvious and why we're all here this evening. The horrifying discovery of 215 Indigenous children found buried in a mass grave at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. You know, there's no words for that tragedy. And what makes it more shameful for me is that Canadians knew that this was the case. We knew that there were thousands of missing children. We knew that there were mass burial sites at residential schools. And we knew this because it was laid out in the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. The TRC has an entire chapter dedicated to laying out that horrifying legacy. There are calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report that specifically deal with how to commemorate and how we may repatriate these Indigenous children back to their families. And it was never acted on. The step to atone for this horrific past, it was never taken. And I find myself asking, have Canadians been willfully blind to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report? Have we been blind to the 50 other reports that came before it talking about the problems that affect Indigenous communities specifically, why they're affected, but also how to fix the problem. Have Canadians been blind to the ongoing legacy of residential schools, to the 60s scoop, to the child welfare crisis, to the resulting poverty and mental health crisis? And the question that I dread to ask is, are we morally bankrupt? We know that it's wrong, that 215 children were stolen from their families and were not provided the basic human dignity that each and every one of us deserves. And we also know that it was more than 215. The numbers continue to rise with regard to the number of children found buried at residential schools. And we have to ask ourselves, what is being done? So at this point, sentiment, while appreciated, is not enough. It is so important that we act on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. We have to be able to move forward on a path of reconciliation, and that requires action. I would like to end with a quote that all of you will be very familiar with. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Miigwech.